Mill moved into my house uninvited after my husband passed away. She spent all our savings on useless things, then got depressed when I started dating again. So I got the law involved. I know this entire situation will sound unreal to most people, and sometimes I still can't believe this is actually my life. The past few years have been a complete mess, and I need to share what happened with others who might understand. My therapist suggested writing about it might help process everything, but finding the right words to explain this complicated situation isn't easy. I've spent months trying to figure out how to tell this story because there's just so much that happened, and every time I try to explain it to someone, they look at me like I'm making it up. So this is my story. My husband's death changed everything in my life. I was only 27 years old when it happened, and suddenly I had to figure out how to be a single parent to our 8-month-old son. The relationship with my mother-in-law became impossible after that. She started blaming me for his death immediately after the funeral, and that blame never stopped. Before his death, we actually had a decent relationship. We went shopping together, had family dinners every Sunday, and she even helped me decorate the nursery when I was pregnant. But after losing her son, she became a completely different person. The woman who once brought me soup when I had morning sickness now couldn't even look at me without showing pure hatred. The accident happened when we were driving home from my best friend's birthday party. We were talking about how my husband had embarrassed himself trying to dance to some song, and he was pretending to be offended by my teasing. I remember that moment so clearly because it was the last time I heard him laugh. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit us directly on the driver's side. The impact was so severe that I lost consciousness immediately. When I woke up in the hospital, I had a massive wound in my stomach from where a piece of the car door had pierced through me. The doctors told me I was lucky because it missed all my vital organs, but I didn't feel lucky at all. I spent 3 weeks in that hospital room, connected to various machines and dealing with multiple surgeries. The drunk driver only had a broken arm and some bruises. I kept thinking about how I was the one who convinced my husband to go to that party. He wanted to stay home because he had an early meeting the next day, but I insisted we should go because my friend would be disappointed if we missed it. The fact that I survived while he didn't felt like some cruel joke, especially since I was the reason we were even on that road that night. The relationship between me and my mother-in-law became more hostile as time went on. I understood that her grief over losing her eldest son was overwhelming. He wasn't just her child, but also the one who helped support their family financially since she stopped working years ago. Her younger daughter was studying and another son was working in California, and her husband's was a retired mechanic, so my husband often stepped in to help with their bills. I tried to be patient with her behavior because I knew how much she depended on him, but everything got significantly worse after we met with a lawyer about the will. My husband had written his will just after our son was born, and he left all his assets to me and the baby. This included our newly purchased house, which we had saved for years to buy, his car that he absolutely loved, and the savings account we had built together since we got married. He was always very careful with money and insisted on having life insurance and everything properly documented in case something happened to either of us. When we signed the papers for the will, he told me it was just a precaution since we had a child now, but he never mentioned anything about his family's reaction to his decisions. My mother-in-law's response to the will reading was aggressive and immediate. She started spreading rumors in our extended family about how I manipulated her son and turned him against them. According to her, I had been planning this from the beginning, marrying him for his money and then somehow convincing him to cut his family out of his will. She told everyone who would listen that I forged the will documents, even though there were witnesses and a notary present when it was signed. The worst part was when she started telling people that I had been slowly poisoning him against his family throughout our marriage, making up stories about fights and arguments that never happened. These accusations were completely false, but they affected my relationships with other family members who started treating me differently. Even some of my husband's cousins who used to be friendly stopped talking to me, believing her version of events. I wanted to avoid any more conflict with my mother-in-law and her family, so I tried to compromise by giving them access to the savings account my husband left. The money wasn't a huge amount since we had recently bought our house, but I thought sharing it would show them I wasn't the greedy person they believed I was. My husband and I had been saving that money for years, putting aside portions of our salaries each month and cutting back on unnecessary expenses. We had plans to use it for our son's future education and maybe some home improvements, but I convinced myself that helping his family was more important at the moment. The decision to share the money turned out to be a massive mistake. My mother-in-law and the rest of the family spent almost all of it within 3 months. They used the money for expensive purchases like a new TV, furniture for their apartment, and even a vacation to visit some relatives in Florida. None of this spending benefited me or my son, and they never consulted me about any of these purchases. I discovered what happened when I tried to pay our property taxes and found the account nearly empty. This left me in a terrible financial situation. I had a mortgage to pay, utility bills piling up, and a baby who needed diapers and formula. I started using my credit cards for basic expenses because I had no other choice. I couldn't ask my own family for help with this situation. My parents were already struggling financially with 3 teenagers still living at home. My youngest sister was about to start college, and my brother needed braces. As the oldest child, I always felt responsible for helping them rather than adding to their burdens. Every time they called to check on me, I pretended everything was fine. I told them the insurance money was enough and that I was managing well with my job. I couldn't bear the thought of them worrying about me or trying to help when they barely had enough for themselves. The situation became even more complicated when my mother-in-law announced that she, my father-in-law, and my 16-year-old sister-in-law were moving into my house. She didn't ask for permission, she just showed up one day with a moving truck full of their belongings. Her excuse was that they wanted to help take care of their grandson, but it became clear that this was about control. They started treating my house like their own property, rearranging furniture and taking over rooms without asking me. I had just started a new job and was still dealing with physical pain from my injuries, so I didn't have the energy to fight them. They seemed to notice this weakness and took advantage of it. The worst part was when they suggested removing the photos of me and my husband from the living room and replacing them with old family pictures that didn't include me. Those photos were from our wedding, and the day we brought our son home from the hospital. Those memories were all I had left of him, and I refused to let them take that away from me. My daily routine became completely overwhelming. I got a job at a marketing firm where my husband used to work, thanks to his former boss who knew about our situation and wanted to help. The job was demanding but gave me a reason to leave the house every morning. I would wake up at 5 a.m. to spend some time with my son before leaving for work, then spend the entire day dealing with client meetings and project deadlines. Coming home was always stressful because the house would be in complete chaos. There would be dirty dishes everywhere, my son's toys scattered across every room, and clothes piled up in the laundry room. My mother-in-law would be sitting in front of the TV while my sister-in-law was locked in her room, and my father-in-law would be napping in my husband's old armchair. My son would already be asleep by the time I got home, so I barely got to see him during weekdays. My mother-in-law had a standard response whenever I brought up the mess or asked for help with housework. She would remind me that she was taking care of my son without getting paid, cooking meals for everyone, and doing some laundry. According to her, cleaning up after everyone was my responsibility since I was the one working outside the house. She never acknowledged that she was living in my house rent-free, using utilities I paid for, and eating food I bought with my salary. My father-in-law's social security checks went entirely to his medical bills and my sister-in-law's private school tuition, so I was covering all household expenses alone. I kept telling myself to be patient with the situation because they were still grieving for my husband. But their behavior wasn't about grief anymore, it was about having power over me and my son. My mother-in-law constantly undermined my parenting decisions. If I told my son he couldn't have cookies before dinner, she would wait until I turned around to give him some anyway. When I tried to establish a bedtime routine, she would tell me I was being too strict. She started telling other family members that I was neglecting my son because I worked long hours, conveniently leaving out the fact that I was supporting 5 people on a single income. These conversations usually happened when she thought I couldn't hear them, but the house walls were thin and I could hear her complaining to my father-in-law and sister-in-law about what a terrible mother I was becoming. My father-in-law would frequently come to my bedroom late at night to lecture me about my parenting skills, often right when I was trying to get some rest before another early morning at work. Despite these confrontations, I actually had a better relationship with him compared to my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. He was a retired mechanic who still did some part-time work at his friend's auto shop, but most of his income went to medical treatments for his heart condition and diabetes. He also insisted on paying for my sister-in-law's expensive private school, which left him with almost nothing to contribute to the household expenses. I understood his situation and respected that he was still trying to work at his age, but I was frustrated that he spent his free time watching TV instead of helping maintain the house he was living in. My sister-in-law's behavior in the house was completely different from how she acted at her prestigious private school, where she was apparently a model student. At home, she treated everything like a permanent sleepover at a friend's house. She would leave her wet towels on the bathroom floor, never clean up after making snacks in the kitchen, and spend hours in her room video chatting with friends. Every time I asked her to help with basic chores, my mother-in-law would jump in to defend her, insisting that a 16-year-old needed to concentrate on her studies. The reality was that most of her time was spent taking selfies for social media and watching Netflix shows on her laptop that I was paying for, along with her phone bill, school supplies, and the new clothes she constantly wanted. The situation with meals in the house was particularly frustrating. My mother-in-law took charge of the kitchen, claiming she was doing me a favor by cooking and taking care of my son's education. She had no teaching experience or qualifications, but she decided she would homeschool him instead of sending him to the daycare where my husband and I had already registered him before the accident. The meals she prepared were usually ready by 6 p.m., but I rarely got home from work before 7:30 p.m. due to my commute. By then, everyone had eaten and there were only leftovers of the things nobody else wanted. I was spending hundreds of dollars every week on groceries, but often ended up making myself a sandwich for dinner. My mother-in-law was adamant about not getting a job despite being perfectly healthy and only 47 years old. She used her grief as an excuse to avoid working, even though I found out from my sister-in-law that she had been looking into starting a small catering business before my husband's death. Every time I brought up the possibility of her finding work to help with the growing expenses, she would start crying and talking about how she couldn't possibly focus on a job while mourning her son. Meanwhile, inflation kept driving up the cost of everything: groceries, utilities, gas for 3 cars since they all still drove their own vehicles. My salary was good for a single person, but supporting 5 people in an expensive suburb was stretching me to my financial limits. One day my mother-in-law asked me for money to help pay for a family vacation she was planning. When I refused and suggested she look for a job instead, she completely lost control. She started screaming about how ungrateful I was for everything she had done for me and my son. The argument happened in the kitchen while my father-in-law was having his morning coffee and my sister-in-law was eating breakfast. My mother-in-law brought up every small thing she had ever done, from changing my son's diapers to cooking meals that I barely got to eat. She even mentioned how she had given up her own life to help raise my son, conveniently forgetting that she had moved into my house without asking. After 3 days of constant pressure from the entire family, I finally agreed to give her the money. My father-in-law kept reminding me about how she had helped during my recovery after the accident, and my sister-in-law stopped speaking to me entirely until I agreed to the loan. However, I had learned from my previous mistakes with the savings account. Before giving her any money, I documented everything. I kept screenshots of all our text messages about the loan, recorded our conversations about repayment terms using my phone, and wrote up a detailed agreement that she had to sign. She rolled her eyes at my insistence on documentation but signed it anyway. Just as I expected, the money disappeared within weeks on shopping trips and restaurant meals not on the vacation like she wanted, and she never acknowledged that she needed to pay it back. This pattern repeated several times over the next few months, with her asking for different amounts for various reasons: car repairs, new clothes for my sister-in-law, and even a laptop she claimed she needed to start looking for jobs online. The financial manipulation was bad enough, but my mother-in-law also started playing psychological games that affected my relationship with my son. She began planning family outings to the park or zoo but would intentionally schedule them when I was at work. She would take my son to visit relatives without telling me, and I would only find out when I saw photos posted on social media. The worst was when she started trying to convince my son to call her mommy instead of grandma. She told him it would be easier to say, but I knew she was trying to replace me in his life. She would correct him whenever he called her grandma, creating confusion for my 2-year-old who was just learning to speak. Fortunately, the bond between my son and me remained strong despite her attempts to interfere. I made sure to be completely present during our time together, playing with him, reading stories, and taking him to the playground on weekends. My work allowed me to leave my laptop at the office, so our evenings and weekends were dedicated entirely to building our relationship. He understood that I was his mother, and no amount of manipulation from his grandmother could change that. I convinced myself that putting up with my mother-in-law's behavior was necessary to provide stability for my son. But after nearly 2 years of this situation, I started secretly preparing for our escape. I opened a separate bank account at a different bank and began saving money from each paycheck. While I told everyone this money was for my son's future education, I was actually building an emergency fund to help us move out and start fresh somewhere else. The guilt I initially felt about my husband's death had been replaced by determination to protect myself and my son from his family's toxic behavior. Everything in my life started to change when Gary joined our marketing team at work. He transferred from the company's Seattle office and was assigned to work on projects with me. Unlike other people who treated me differently after learning about my situation, Gary saw me as a complete person, not just a tragic story. He had gone through his own difficult experiences, losing his sister to cancer a few years ago, so he understood grief without letting it define someone. We started having lunch together, and he would make me laugh with stories about his terrible attempts at cooking or his ongoing feud with his neighbor's cat. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt like myself again, not just a widow or a single mother dealing with a difficult family situation. I kept my relationship with Gary completely private for several months, not telling anyone except my best friend who lived in another state. I knew my mother-in-law would find a way to use any information about my personal life against me, so I was extremely careful. Even my parents didn't know about him because they sometimes talked to my mother-in-law on the phone about my son. The secrecy was necessary because every time something good happened in my life, from getting a promotion at work to making new friends, my mother-in-law would find a way to criticize it or create problems. However, during one evening when my sister-in-law was sitting in the living room, I accidentally mentioned Gary's name while talking about a work project. She seemed completely absorbed in her phone at the time, looking at TikTok videos with her headphones on, so I didn't think she was paying attention to my conversation. I completely underestimated how quickly information traveled in our house. My sister-in-law told her mother about Gary that same night, probably during one of their late-night conversations in the kitchen when they thought I was sleeping. My mother-in-law spent the next day gathering information from my sister-in-law's social media connections at work, since one of her school friends had an older sister who worked in our office building. By the time she confronted me, she knew not only about Gary but also about the lunches we had together. My mother-in-law waited until I was making dinner to confront me about Gary. She had clearly planned this moment, waiting until I was chopping vegetables and couldn't easily walk away from the conversation. She started interrogating me about my relationship with him, acting like I was committing some terrible crime by spending time with another man. Even though it had been just over a year since my husband's death, my mother-in-law acted like I was betraying him by even talking to another man. The reality was that Gary and I had only been on 2 actual dates outside of work, and I was being incredibly cautious about moving forward because of my son. But my mother-in-law wasn't interested in these facts. In her mind, I would always belong to her son, even after his death. The situation quickly deteriorated after that conversation. My mother-in-law started creating obstacles whenever I tried to go anywhere after work. She would suddenly have appointments or errands when I needed her to watch my son, even though she had been insisting on taking care of him every day for the past year. She started telling my son stories about his father every night before bed, emphasizing how much he looked like him and how no one could ever replace his daddy. One morning, things reached a breaking point when she blocked the front door and refused to let me leave for work. She was screaming about how I was betraying her son's memory by seeing another man, insisting that I had no right to move on with my life. My father-in-law had to intervene when I threatened to call the police, reminding her that she couldn't legally prevent me from leaving my own house. She eventually moved away from the door. I tried to ignore my mother-in-law's behavior about Gary, hoping she would eventually accept the situation. I focused on my work and spent time with my son, trying to keep our routine as normal as possible. The marketing firm had just assigned me a big client account, and I needed to concentrate on the upcoming presentation. My mother-in-law had other plans though. She showed up at my office during our monthly team meeting, where all the department heads were present. She started crying in the middle of the lobby, telling everyone within earshot about how I was neglecting my family. She went on about how she and my father-in-law were the ones taking care of everything at home while I was busy dating random men from the office. The entire situation at work became unbearable after my mother-in-law's outburst. Gary was sitting next to me during the presentation when she burst in, and I could see the mix of shock and concern on his face. My coworkers, who had spent months building professional relationships with, watched as my mother-in-law called me an unfit filth mother in front of everyone. My boss called me into his office that afternoon and gave me a formal warning about keeping my personal life separate from work. He mentioned that some of our clients had witnessed the scene, and it reflected poorly on the company. The warning meant I could lose my job if anything similar happened again. This incident was different from all her previous actions. It threatened my ability to provide for my son. The next morning, I started going through my emails and text messages from the past year. I had screenshots of every conversation where my mother-in-law had asked to borrow money, always with promises of paying it back soon. Each time she claimed it was for something important, car repairs, medical bills, or school expenses for my sister-in-law. But I also had credit card statements showing where the money actually went, expensive restaurants, shopping at high-end stores, and even a weekend trip to a spa. I had saved videos from our home security camera showing her telling my son negative things about me when she thought no one was watching. The audio recordings from my phone captured her admitting to spending money on unnecessary things while refusing to contribute to the household expenses. She had even signed formal acknowledgments for the larger loans, probably thinking I was too weak to ever use them against her. I started researching family law attorneys in our area, focusing on those who specialized in complex family disputes. Through a recommendation from a coworker who had gone through a divorce, I found a lawyer with extensive experience in cases involving financial exploitation and emotional abuse. During our first meeting, I brought all my documentation, and she spent over 2 hours going through everything. She explained that my mother-in-law's actions constituted both financial and emotional abuse, and we had enough evidence to not only reclaim the money but also secure legal protection against future harassment. The lawyer also pointed out that my husband's will gave me clear ownership of the house, which meant my mother-in-law had no legal right to live there without my permission. After establishing our legal strategy, I took additional steps to protect myself and Gary from my mother-in-law's interference. The lawyer helped me file for a restraining order specifically preventing her from coming to my workplace again. This was crucial because my job was our only source of income, and I couldn't risk losing it. We also drafted a formal cease and desist letter that outlined all her harassing behaviors and made it clear that any further attempts to interfere with my life or relationship with Gary would result in immediate legal action. The letter included specific references to her showing up at my workplace and her attempts to alienate my son from me. I planned the move carefully over several weeks. I knew my mother-in-law and father-in-law always went to their church group on Saturday mornings, which gave me a predictable window of time. My sister-in-law was trickier to handle because she was always home, but I gave her money to go shopping with her friends, something she had been asking for but my mother-in-law had refused. Gary helped me find a storage unit in advance, and we packed essential items gradually. On the morning of the move, Gary brought his truck and 2 friends from his gym to help us move quickly and efficiently. I left a simple note on the kitchen counter where I knew they would find it. The furniture wasn't important to me, most of it was old stuff they had brought from their house anyway. I took only what legally belonged to me and my son, our clothes, important documents, family photos, and my husband's personal belongings that I had saved for our son. The note was direct and clear, stating that any further communication would need to go through my lawyer. I also took photos of the house's condition before leaving, knowing my mother-in-law might try to claim I damaged their belongings. After blocking my mother-in-law and sister-in-law on all communication platforms, I stayed at Gary's apartment with my son. My mother-in-law tried every possible way to reach me. She called my parents multiple times a day, contacted everyone we knew in common, and even reached out to my old college friends on Facebook. My parents were supportive of my decision after I explained everything that had happened. They had noticed something was wrong during their visits but didn't want to interfere. My mother later told me she had always felt uncomfortable with how my mother-in-law treated me but wasn't sure how to help. The legal notice from my lawyer triggered exactly the reaction I expected from my mother-in-law. She showed up at the house the next morning to find the locks changed and a formal eviction notice posted on the door. Her first response was to call the police, claiming I had illegally evicted her and stolen her property. When the police arrived, I had my lawyer explain the situation. I was the legal owner of the house, there was no rental agreement, and they had been living there without paying any rent or utilities. The police advised her that this was a civil matter and that she needed to follow the legal process. She had to hire a moving company to get their belongings out of the house within the court-ordered timeframe. The legal battle lasted several months because my mother-in-law hired a lawyer who tried to claim she had established residency rights. However, my detailed financial records proved to be invaluable. The documents showed that not only had she never contributed to the household expenses, but she also owed me over $30,000 in unpaid loans. Her lawyer examined the evidence, including the signed loan agreements, text messages, bank transfers, and audio recordings, and advised her to settle. We eventually reached an agreement where she would repay the loans in monthly installments over 3 years, and she had to sign a legal document acknowledging that she had no claim to the house. Despite the restraining order, my mother-in-law violated it several times. The most dramatic incident happened 2 months after the settlement when she cornered me in the parking lot at work. She had lost weight and looked completely different. She started crying about how she had no money and nowhere to go, asking me to help her one last time. My father-in-law had moved in with his sister in another state, and my sister-in-law was living with her mother's cousin and attending a different school. Their family had completely fallen apart, but I couldn't bring myself to feel responsible for that. They had created this situation through their own actions, and now they were facing the consequences. The unexpected message from my brother-in-law came through LinkedIn, of all places. He had only attended our wedding back then because my husband insisted, and I barely knew anything about him except that he lived in California and worked in tech. In his message, he explained that he had been following our family situation through occasional updates from his father, but hadn't realized how bad things had gotten. Unlike the angry messages I received from other family members, his approach was completely different. He took full responsibility for staying away and allowing his mother's behavior to continue unchecked. During our phone conversation, he revealed that he had distanced himself from the family because of similar controlling behavior from his mother throughout his childhood. He shared stories about growing up with her that helped me understand the family dynamics better. Their mother had always been possessive and manipulative, but it was worse with my husband because he was the oldest and took on the role of family provider after their father's health struggled. My brother-in-law escaped by accepting a scholarship across the country, which caused a huge family rift at the time. He admitted feeling guilty about leaving his brother to deal with their mother alone, but he needed to break free from her control. When he told me about how happy his brother had been after meeting me, how he had called to share the news about becoming a father, I finally broke down. It was the first time someone from my husband's family had acknowledged our relationship as something positive. I'm sharing this story now because I finally feel secure in my decisions. The weekly calls with my brother-in-law have helped me process a lot of what happened. My mother-in-law still attempts to contact me every few months, usually when she needs money. Her recent messages have included apologies and acknowledgments of her behavior, but they always come with requests for help or attempts to see my son. While I appreciate that she might be trying to change, I'm not willing to risk the peace and stability we've built. My therapist helped me understand that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone back into your life. The last message I received from my mother-in-law was different from her usual attempts. She admitted that she had been wrong about everything and wanted to apologize properly. She mentioned going to therapy herself and understanding how her grief had turned into toxic behavior. While part of me wants to believe she's changed, I know that maintaining our distance is the healthiest choice for everyone involved. My current focus is on building a future with Gary, raising my son in a peaceful environment, and honoring my husband's memory in a way that's healthy and respectful.